Hello and welcome to the Sector 1 Motorsport podcast in partnership with Formula Careers. Now, on today's episode, you can obviously see I am joined by someone who has worked in communications for McLaren, Aston Martin, and W Series. He has an incredibly extensive career in the world of motorsport. Please welcome Matt Bishop. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So, I know I gave you a little bit of an introduction there, but for those who may not be so familiar with yourself, could you give us a little bit of an introduction?
Okay, so I suppose I've been working in motorsport and almost all of it in Formula One for 30 years. I'm 61 now, so that meant I started when I was about 30 odd. And I started as a journalist. The first 15 years were as a journalist, which I absolutely loved, and editor. And then I joined McLaren as communications director, working with Lewis Hamilton, Checo Perez, Heikki Kovalainen, Jenson Button, Kevin Magnussen, Stoffel Van Dorn, etc. And then as you say, I went to W Series, which was very, very different, a startup, whereas, of course, McLaren was hugely well established already, and only women drivers. I mean, I absolutely loved it. Unfortunately, it didn't last, but I always regard it as the Sony Betamax of women's racing, with VHS being what is the F1 Academy. In other words, I think the F1 Academy has thrived, but it might not have got a start had W Series not paved the way. At least that's what I like to think. And anyway, I spent a couple of years there, and then Lawrence Stroll invited me to join him at Aston Martin when he rebranded the team that had been known as Racing Point, Aston Martin. And I spent 2 years there working with his son Lance, of course, but also with Sebastian Vettel. And I absolutely loved working with Seb. Great guy. And then in the end, I turned 60 and I thought that was enough charging around the world, going on to 20-something Grand Prix per year, which I'd done for so long and was so exhausting, although so, invigorating. But, it's slightly a young person's game. So then I started my own agency, Diagonal Comms, which I now run, which does comms, PR, media relations, content creation, digital marketing, etc., social media activations as well for a number of clients in motorsport. So that's me. That's my whistle-stop tour over the last 30 years.
Okay, so I'm going to take you all the way back to the beginning of that tour. And I want to know, when did you fall in love with motorsport? Where did that all stem from?
Well, I was never brought up to it. A lot of people, a lot of boys, they were taken off to Brands Hatch or Silverstone or wherever by their dads. Not always by their dads, and of course not only boys, but in my generation it was usually a dad-son thing. Now I think it's an all-the-family thing, or a mum-daughter thing, or any combination of those family dynamics. But anyway, lots of my friends were taken off by their dads. I wasn't. My dad was a concert pianist, American, but obviously met and married my mother here in London. But I actually think he wouldn't have heard of Formula One when I was born in 1962. I genuinely think he wouldn't have heard of it. He might have heard of the Indy 500, but he wouldn't have watched it. He certainly didn't even know what Formula One was. I think he just about knows what it is now. And my mum, ditto, absolutely no interest or knowledge either. So I was one of these geeky kids that used to walk along the street picking out cars, even when I was very young, picking out and naming the cars, the makes and the models, whatever they were. They had old-fashioned names then, things like Austin, Cambridge, and Morris Oxford. Imagine cars being called that now. But anyway, I picked them out. And then I suddenly, when I think it was in 1972, I would have been 9, and in a newsagent, I spotted a magazine called Autosport. And it had this very different looking car on the cover, which I later learned was Jackie Stewart's Tyrrell, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. It was a Formula One car. And it certainly didn't look like an Austin Cambridge or a Morris Oxford. And I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And I started getting Autosport as a 9-year-old, and just educated myself. And that was 52 years ago. And, you know, that's half a century of full immersion in the sport that I have loved almost all my life, and actually have earned my trust from all this time, and still do. Because, of course, I don't just do my agency, Diagonal Comms. I also write a weekly column for the website of Motorsport magazine, which is the most venerable and oldest magazine there is in motorsport. In fact, it's 100 years old this year. You see, the website isn't 100 years old, but I write for the website of the magazine that's 100 years old. And I also do a weekly podcast in batches of 10, and we've done our first series of 10. It's called And Colossally, That's History, and we're about to restart our second batch of 10, and I do that with a colleague and a friend, Richard Williams. So I do a number of things now. I'm far from retired. I'm far from semi-retired, but I don't get on planes very often anymore, and I prefer it that way.
Yes. So that's obviously where your love began. When that began, did you kind of have that aspiration to work in motorsport? Was that something you could imagine yourself doing?
Well, not at 9. I mean, at 9, I really had no idea what I was going to do. But even as I grew older through schooling and began to think about careers, no, I didn't. You have to remember that Formula One was nothing like it is now, nothing like as big. You know, a Formula One team now has more than 1,000 people. Let's talk about McLaren, because that's a team I've worked for, and that was a team that already existed then. So the McLaren Technology Centre in Woking, which I worked at for 10 years, you know, is a cathedral to motorsport, a cathedral to Formula One. And even discounting the road car side, the production sports cars, there's 1,000 people that work in that Formula One team. But when Emerson Fittipaldi won McLaren's first World Championship in 1974, 20 people, maybe. And they did IndyCar as well, and Can-Am. Just extraordinary. But my God, they worked hard. I mean, everyone works hard in Formula One and in motor racing now, but my goodness, they worked hard. And they didn't have a factory, let alone a cathedral. They had something they called a workshop, you know, and it was just a lockup. It was just a little workshop, a little premises. And so the idea of forging a career in motorsport really didn't exist. And by the way, the only jobs were drivers, which I knew I wasn't going to be, or mechanics, which I knew I wasn't going to be. There wasn't this army of people that I now know that I could be and am, which is media professionals, comms people, marketing people, sponsorship people, commercial people. They didn't exist. They absolutely didn't exist. So no, I absolutely didn't think that there was a possibility to work in Formula One. And if you told me, I just mentioned Emerson Fittipaldi. So if you told me when Emerson Fittipaldi was winning that first McLaren World Championship in 1974, when I would have been 11, if you told me, oh, by the way, he's going to end up being someone who you could call a friend, and you're going to write a book with him, and you're going to have the odd WhatsApp with him, and when you go to races, you're going to give him a hug. And I mean, I would think that you were completely deranged. But that is exactly what has happened. And I did write a book with him, which is called Emo, A Racer's Soul. It's by him, but I wrote it with him. And what a wonderful person he is, by the way. If you've got any time, I'm not recommending it because it's my words. I'm recommending it because it's his words. And Emerson Fittipaldi is a proper legend.
That's one of my favourite things that I just absolutely love about motorsport, particularly when you look at new drivers coming in now, is that they get to drive alongside their heroes. You work alongside people that you admired. And I love that almost full circle moment that you have there. It's incredible. I love it.
It's amazing. It's
Yeah.
absolutely amazing. And yes, I mean the in recent races this season, of course, I watched them all, and all my old mates watched them all. I mean, for instance, the Italian Grand Prix this year, which was an interesting race because obviously Charles Leclerc won it, and should McLaren have won it if they played their cards differently and played the strategy differently? Well, that's a big subject. But I was having WhatsApp conversations about that with Alex Wurz, Pedro de la Rosa, Keke Rosberg, and again, just for fun, not for work, just for fun. And the idea that I would be, trading opinions with legends of the sport is still something I have to pinch myself.
I love that. I love that. So let's talk about the very beginning of your career and your studies. When you started studying at university, did you have an idea of where you were trying to go with that?
Confession time. I didn't go to university at the right time. I it's all motorsport's fault. I remember, I don't mean Motorsport magazine, I mean the sport. My mum used to say to me, why aren't you revising for your O-levels, which are, the equivalent that we used to have now for GCSEs? I said, well, I am. She said, no, you're not, darling. You're reading Autosport again. Or Motorsport News, which was then called Motoring News, or Motorsport, or Grand Prix International, which was a great magazine at the time. And or Auto Car, which, although it was a road car magazine, had brilliant reports written by Peter Windsor. And again, he is a friend now. And I'd be amazed, the 11-year-old me would be amazed to know that I'm a friend of, that 50 years later, I'd be a friend of Peter Windsor, but I am. And so my advice is do as I say, not as I do. I threw myself into motorsport, Formula One, and didn't study enough, and then didn't really. I did go back to university a little while later, and combined it with my early bits of journalism, which is why I didn't really get started until 30, which is as a working journalist, as a fully working journalist. So no, I didn't really have a conventional route. And when young people say to me, could you tell me your career route so I can replicate it? I say, well, no, because I can't give you anything that you can replicate. Because I've always been incredibly lucky in everything. In everything, I've been very lucky. And, if you tried to do what I did all those years ago, and in the hope that it would lead you to a job in motorsport, it would not. So I'm good at giving people advice, but the first bit of advice is don't do what I did. And what I advise people to do if they want to get on in, assuming they don't want to be drivers or mechanics or engineers, because yes, I can talk about that as well, but then they have to study engineering and study aerodynamics and do all that. But if you want to get a job in the kind of areas in motorsport in which I've worked, in other words, the media, marketing, comms, commercials, all that, backroom boys and girls, then you can't start in Formula One really. You have to start lower down, and you probably have to start with extremely low expectations of salary, perhaps even nothing. In other words, writing for websites that don't pay, and getting on your bike literally sometimes, or at least on the train, or borrowing your mum's car or whatever it is to get to Snetterton or Thruxton or Croft or Knockhill, and beg, borrow or steal, not steal, beg or borrow the opportunity to write news stories, features, race reports for websites that will pay you nothing, but assemble a dossier of bylined material that then you can, once you've got that dossier, you can parlay to people who might pay you in the future. In other words, for people who run websites like Motorsport, Autosport, The Race, etc., etc. But it's a tough gig. And, motorsport journalism doesn't pay what it used to pay. But none of us ever did it for money, really. We did it for love. And, any of us who've managed to screw a few bob out of it over the years has been more by luck than by judgment or design. People do earn huge money in motorsport, obviously, the drivers, some of the team principals, some of the most senior engineers, Lewis Hamilton, Toto Wolff, Adrian Newey. These are very, very wealthy men. But journalists don't get that kind of money and never could get that kind of money, nor even a tiny fraction of it. And now it's pretty tough, I would say. But hey, if you want to do it, it is a great life and a wonderful calling. And there is something special about, being in the field, whether it's at Silverstone or Monza or Spa or Suzuka, watching the sport you love and then finding that you are earning your living out of it, even if it's not a huge living.
And would you say that university is necessary in order to get into a position like you've been in?
No. And again, I don't want to be a bad influence, because if somebody, has offers at university and they want to go and study, then obviously they should. And I know higher education is very important, but I don't have a degree. I did begin a degree course, actually two, one at the University of Kent at Canterbury and one at City University in London. But I didn't complete either because in the end I got offered a job that I wanted, which was a job at Car Magazine, which is about cars, obviously, and still exists. And I was able to write about cars and from there write about motor racing as well, racing cars. And then racing drivers. But I realized I was lucky. Having said that, in my agency, Diagonal Comms, I have actually just taken on a young man, a new starter, who's 18. And, he clever guy, he had offers to go to university. He said, I'd like to, and I was using him as a freelance, but I was paying him. I wasn't doing what I've just described. I was paying him because I personally reckon that if somebody's good enough to work for you, you ought to be good enough to pay them to do so. But anyway, he said, I'd love to work for you. And I said, well, what about university? You're only 18. And he said, well, very mature beyond his years, I would say. He said, well, if I had an opportunity to work with you, Matt, in your agency, alongside your colleagues, with your clients, then that job is pretty much ideal for me now at my stage, I think. And if I spent 3 or 4 years at university, and even if I got a great degree, I would saddle myself with a, 40, 50 grand debt. And then I'd be trying to get exactly the job that you might be going to offer me now. So I'd be 4 years or 3 years behind and 40 or 50 grand light or behind as well. So if you'd be happy to have me now, I will sacrifice my university career. And it was a bit of a scruples moment because I thought, well, he's an adult, he's 18. I don't have to ask his mum and dad. But on the other hand, I don't want to step in the way or get in the way of a young person and their higher education. But he was absolutely adamant. And I did actually say, do your mum and dad support this? Not that that was required from a legal point of view because he was 18. He said they do. So look, I think you have to analyze your options at all times. But if you are absolutely sure that what you want to do is work in motorsport in the kind of job where you don't need higher education. So obviously not as an aerodynamicist, because you would need not only you need a BSc, an MSc, and perhaps even a doctorate in aerodynamics to do that, and that would take you many years. But if you wanted to be a journalist or a comms person or a marketing person or a sponsorship getter or something like that, which is the kind of area that I've worked in, and many people want to work in because they're not drivers and they're not engineers and they're not scientists, then if you're absolutely adamant that's what you want to do, then go do it and take a bit of a risk. Or if you really want to be kind of give yourself the insurance policy of a degree, then also do that. But you might delay your opportunity to forge your future in motorsport. It is a tricky choice, and there is no right or wrong answer. But I think this young man that I've just hired will be very successful with us, and I'm very pleased to have hired him, and I hope he will be pleased with the decision he's made in the end.
Definitely. I love that you've said that, because I've just completed my 3 years at university and I've got that massive debt now. But I was lucky enough to be working at the same time for the BBC. And I truly think, looking back on it, I learnt more in those summers and Christmases that I spent at the BBC than I did in those lecture rooms. I learnt so much more hands on stuff. And I look back on it and I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I did uni because I made great friends. I had that life experience. But from the educational perspective, I could have just freelanced at the BBC for the whole 3 years and been very, very happy with what I'd have learned.
Yeah, well, yes. Look, and neither you nor I are trying to dissuade people from going to university, are we?
Definitely not.
But you learn so much in the field.
You
You
really
learn
do.
so much. You learn so much. And one of the things I want to do with this young man, he's called George. One of these things I want to do is I want to, shave years off his learning curve, which I can because I've done so much and learned so much myself. I've forgotten more than lots of people know in terms of the media landscape of motor racing. But I also, and I said this to him, I said, I'm 61 and you're 18. So we might overlap for, let's say, 4 years. Let's say 4 years. We're at completely the opposite ends of our careers. But I hope that I can teach you a few things over those 4 years, and you can benefit from my experience and my contacts and the strategies that you just find that you just do without even thinking, because you just know what to do. Oh, if that happens, we should do this, because you've just done it so many times. But I said, I also want to learn from you, because old people can learn from young people. And I want to fill my boots and make sure that I learn things from you that I couldn't earn from a fellow oldie. And I think that's a good exchange. Exchange is no robbery.
Now let's have a little chat about your time working in communications. You spent time with McLaren, Aston Martin, and I know it's been a long, long time doing all of this. You've spent many years doing that. This might be a difficult question, but I want to know, what is your fondest memory whilst working for McLaren or Aston Martin?
Well, not Aston Martin, not because I didn't enjoy it. I did, but it was only 2 years. And the bits I enjoyed were with Seb. I mean, those are the bits I enjoyed the most, I must admit. Our car wasn't good. We didn't win races. But I did a lot of work with Seb around diversity, equity, and inclusion, including but not limited to LGBTQ plus advocacy. Obviously, I'm a gay man. He's a straight man, but straight allies are incredibly important. And it is an important issue because Formula One goes to countries which are most disadvantageous to LGBTQ plus people. So Seb embraced that. I enjoyed that enormously. And we won awards for that. We won an award from the race media for most inspiring campaign. And I must admit, to win something for most inspiring, and I was very, very chuffed to go up with my colleagues to collect it, my Aston Martin colleagues, and really we were collecting it on behalf of Seb. That was great. So I enjoyed that part enormously. McLaren, the bit I enjoyed is easy to say, because I was in the garage at Interlagos in 2008, having worked incredibly closely with Lewis Hamilton. And if you remember that year, the year before, 2007, when I wasn't there, because I joined on the 1st of January 2008, but in 2007, the team had been fined $100 million for unlawful possession of Ferrari IP, in other words, designs. And, you know, the team nearly died. But instead of dying, we managed to survive. And Ron Dennis hired me. And I went down with the team to Australia, that first race, and we won. Lewis Hamilton won, and we beat Ferrari. And then Ferrari won more races, and then we won in Monaco. And the season went on with a lot of controversy and difficulty. Court cases around, for instance, the Belgian Grand Prix. I remember being in the Salle du Comité, as it was called, or it probably still is called, the FIA conference room with lots of World Motorsport Council people and lawyers and barristers. I was there with Lewis, Martin Whitmarsh, our lawyers, all sorts. Anyway, it all came down to the final race, of course, which was the Brazilian Grand Prix. And it wasn't just that, because it didn't just come down to the final race. It came down to the last race, yes, but also the last lap and the last corner on that last lap. You couldn't make it up. And even now, 16 years later, I'm having the little hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I'm remembering it, because I remember that last lap, and I remember Lewis was sixth and he had to be fifth. Felipe Massa was leading the race. And if he led the race and we stayed sixth, Felipe Massa was winning the World Championship. And by the way, he was winning the World Championship in a Ferrari at home, his home city, Sao Paulo, in front of all his family and all his friends and the cheering thousands. And he did win. And as he crossed the line, he thought he had done it. He thought he had won the World Championship for Ferrari in his home city, in front of his family, in front of all his friends and the cheering thousands. But a few seconds behind him, something was unfolding, because we had thought, and the world had thought, that Lewis Hamilton had to overtake Sebastian Vettel, who was in the Toro Rosso, to get fifth place, which he didn't manage to do. But ahead, in fourth place, was Timo Glock in the Ferrari. And both Vettel and Hamilton went past him. And on the very last corner of the very last lap, while Ferrari were already deliriously celebrating in the garage, we realized that no, we had won the World Championship instead. And I can't tell you, everybody just lost control. We lost control. We just, you know, I was hoarse. My voice had gone the next morning, and I didn't even know how that had happened. I must have shouted so loud. And, you know, when you see people celebrate, you know, when you watch the World Cup and somebody wins the World Cup final on penalties, or you see somebody hit the winning passing shot at Wimbledon to become the singles champion, or anything like that, or they breast the tape first to become Olympic 100-meter sprint champion. Those moments of pure euphoria. And sometimes the way they punch the air and the way they celebrate is, you think to yourself, that can't really be real. They can't be that happy. My God, you are. You absolutely are. And Formula One, you know, a lot of fans think that Formula One is about drivers, and of course it is. But when you're really in the middle of a team, you know it's a team sport, and the drivers know that too. That's why the drivers use the word we all the time. You notice they don't say, you know, I was very pleased with my pole lap. They say we were very pleased with our pole lap, because they know it's a team effort. And we absolutely screamed the place down. And it is definitely my happiest and best memory from my Formula One career. And it's probably one of the greatest days of my life and always will be.
I can imagine that's one of those unforgettable moments. Even for fans, that's one of those unforgettable moments. So to be able to experience that at your team as well, I cannot imagine. I hope I get to experience something like that
I
one
hope you
day.
do. I really do hope you do. I will just add one thing to that, which is, of course, it was a triumph for us and a triumph for Lewis. But I want to just say something about Felipe Massa. I know he's now considering, or perhaps is still considering, this ill-advised legal action. I hope he doesn't go through with it. I don't think he'll win if he does go through with it. But anyway, I hope he doesn't do so. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is what an extraordinary sporting performance he did, because he had been about as disappointed as a sports person is possible to be that afternoon, because he thought he'd done it at home in a Ferrari, in front of all his mates, in front of his family, in front of all the cheering thousands. And then it turned out that his hopes were dashed and he hadn't. And I remember taking Lewis from journalist to journalist and TV crew to TV crew. And by the way, the Interlagos paddock is very congested and tight. So there was not a lot of room. And I remember just a huge kind of melee of legs and arms and cameras and booms and sound, all that type of thing. And suddenly, it's about 20 minutes after we'd started doing the post-race media, this little figure in red wiggled its way through the legs and arms and cameras and booms of all the journalists and TV crews and put his hand up. And it was Felipe Massa. And he said, "Lewis, congratulations," and shook his hand. I think it's one of the most impressive gestures I've ever seen, and brilliant. And Lewis certainly recognized it in that way. And Felipe, my goodness, I hope he doesn't go through with this legal thing, but he earned my proper respect that day.
Yeah, amazing sportsmanship. So
Yeah.
you mentioned towards the beginning a plethora of drivers that you've worked with. In a role like yours, is it challenging to be working with so many drivers because they're always coming in and out? Is it difficult having to change and work with new personalities all the time?
I don't think it is. Um, you, I mean, look, you really don't have to work with more than two at a time in Formula One. You might have a test driver, you might have a reserve driver, you might have some drivers on the young driver development program if your team has one, and most of them now do, certainly the big ones. But you're really focusing on the two race drivers. And, you know, in the same way as, you know, if a footballer plays for Manchester United, he's absolutely focused on Manchester United. But if he's transferred to Manchester City, he becomes absolutely focused on Manchester City. And that is just turned off and on like a light switch. And that's what you're like. You know, you are paid to do what you can to optimize the chances of victory in whatever department you work in of your two drivers. And often you end up working closely with them and developing good, collaborative, friendly relationships with them. And I'm very lucky to have worked with 4 world champions. And so Lewis Hamilton, Jenson Button, Fernando Alonso, and Sebastian Vettel. And I had good relationships with all of them. I would say particularly Hamilton and Vettel, who I'm in touch with now from time to time. I don't mean we go around each other's houses and have tea, but I might send the odd WhatsApp and I might get a reply. I might not always get a reply. They're very busy people, and more people are trying to contact them than are trying to contact me by an order of magnitude. I realise that, but no, I've worked very well with them, and also drivers that are less successful. I mean, Kevin Magnussen is a proper friend. In fact, I went with my husband to visit him in Copenhagen just a few weekends ago. And, you know, we went to Copenhagen, but we had dinner on the Friday night in a very nice restaurant with him and his wife, Louisa, sorry. And then I said Louise because sometimes she's called Lulu, actually, but her real name is Louisa. And then on the Sunday, we went to their house, which is in Roskilde. It's not actually in Copenhagen. And just hung out there for a while. And Kev is a proper mate, actually. I hope he manages to, take his situation at the moment, which is a difficult one because he doesn't currently have a drive next year. And he may not have a Formula One drive next year, I suppose. But I think he's only 31. And I think that he may well and should embrace other formulae, perhaps in Europe or perhaps even in the United States, and perhaps even have the experience of, which would be refreshing for him, having tugged around at the back of the field for many years now. I think the idea of having a car that you can stick on the pole and win in, I think would be nice for him. So I hope he does do that. But yeah, he's a friend, Stoffel van Dorn. We're always WhatsApping, and he did live in London for a while, and we used to socialise a bit. He doesn't live here now, and various other ones. But no, it's quite easy to focus on the drivers that are in your viewfinder in that sense. Yeah.
So this might be a bit of a difficult one because I am completely aware that each race weekend may not be the same. Lots of different things are happening. But can you give us a bit of an idea of what let's say a typical race day would be like as the head of communications? What are we doing? What have we got going on?
Do you know, there is no typical race weekend and there's
Yeah.
no typical race day. That's a fact. If nothing untoward happens, and by untoward I mean you neither win nor have something dreadful happen, like a shunt in which one of your drivers is hurt, or even just taken to hospital and transpires not to be injured in any way, but it's still a process and a concern, or a penalty, or argy-bargy, with one of the drivers against one of the other drivers. These things happen. So any of those things happen. I mean, obviously the thing you want to happen is win. And then, you are going to have a lot of work to be done afterwards. But it's great work because all the media want to speak to your winning driver. So you have to organize that. And you have to make sure that the TV that's live goes first. And the TV that's pre-recorded as live goes second. And then the journalists go third, the ones that are writing their reports. Everybody wants to go first. So it's a kind of a bit of a diplomacy battle, but you have to do it that way. And you have to make sure that the driver is on board. I mean, for instance, McLaren have recently had some problems in that area because although they've been doing very well on track, their media narratives have been complex because should they have favoured Lando Norris over Oscar Piastri? This is an ongoing problem or controversy, and there's no right or wrong answer because different opinions are applicable and defensible. But it means that you can turn a victory into an on-track victory into a on-line defeat. So you have to try very hard not to do that, and you have to strategize and second guess. If I do this, or if the drivers say this, how will that transpire in the media? By the way, I think media people, journalists, comms people are, in and of their nature, strategists, because all this thought is strategic. When journalists are trying to work out, is it true that Adrian Newey might join Aston Martin, or is it not true? They're actually thinking strategically. They're thinking strategically, trying to combine all the different bits of strains of evidence that they may have with what they know of the team, with what they know of the person, to try to come to a conclusion and puzzle it out. It's detective work. And by the way, if you're doing comms or PR work, you're doing a similar thing, because you're saying, if we say this or we do this, how will that play out in the media? And it's a strange thing, but most people in Formula One are not strategists. They may be geniuses, but they're not strategists. They're tactical, pragmatic opportunists. Now, I've worked with Ron Dennis for many years, one of the most successful people in the history of our sport, still the most successful team principal in Formula One history. Not a strategist. He might say he was. He's a tactical, pragmatic opportunist, and incredibly good at it, and hugely successful and incredibly rich, but not a strategist. I think strategy is an interesting thing. So, and it requires you to have to adapt and react. So if you have success like a victory, you have to play it well in that way. If you have a disaster or a controversy or a problem, you have to react in that way. There is no standard operational procedure for a comms director or a comms team at a motor race. If you qualify 6th and 8th and finish 6th and 8th and don't have any shunts and don't get in anybody's way and you don't have a penalty, it's actually quite dull, because you just roll it out. You watch your cars go through the motions, and then you write a press release, which nobody's going to pay a huge amount of attention to because you finished 6th and 8th and you weren't part of the story. But you still got to do it. And it's just as hard work as when you've won. But it's a little bit less fun.
Right, now I'm going to switch it up a bit. We're going to go over to the fact that you are one of the founding ambassadors of Racing Pride. I think it's very, very important to mention. I think lots of people are very familiar with them now, but for those who maybe aren't, could you explain to us a little bit about who they are and what they do?
So we inaugurated Racing Pride. I say we. Richard Morris, who runs it, who's a young racing driver and a very good one, it was his brainchild, and he came to see me, and we went to a pub in Victoria in London, and he said, right, I'm thinking of doing this. And I thought it was a good idea, and I wanted to support it. And we did launch it. This was in 2019. And we launched it under the auspices and support of Stonewall, which is a charity, an LGBTQ plus charity in the UK. And why do we do so? Because people often ask me, why do we do so? Life for LGBTQ plus people is much easier now, isn't it, Matt, than it used to be when you were young? Well, maybe in some ways, but only for some people and only in some places. Actually, for trans people, it's probably every bit as difficult, or perhaps worse. And as a gay man living in London, which is me, yes, perhaps it is easier now in 2024 than it was in 1984. But not if you live in Islamabad, or Riyadh, or Karachi, or even pockets of rural countries that you would think were necessarily, not the deep south of America, not South Wales. I'm not picking on South Wales, but you see what I mean? It's not like living in Islington or going out for a drink with your mates in Soho, or hanging out in Paris or Berlin or Barcelona or Melbourne or New York, where, of course, LGBTQ plus people are commonplace. So I think there is still a battle. And within Formula One, and motorsport particularly, there is a battle for a number of reasons. One is that Formula One races in places that, actually some places where for gay men to have sex with each other, it isn't often meted out, this punishment, but it can be on the statute book, that they are publicly beheaded. Well, that's quite a serious sanction, isn't it? It doesn't happen very often, but it is on the statute book. And if you live in a country where it is on the statute book that if you have sex with your same-sex partner, you may potentially be publicly beheaded. Even if you're not publicly beheaded, you know very well that you are not welcomed and accepted and embraced. So you live a fearful, closeted life. And that happens in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and various other places. So that's one reason. The other reason is that I think, and we are having a good cut through of success on this with Racing Pride, is that traditionally team bosses in, let's say, junior karting were quite not particularly enlightened, let's say. They were usually heterosexual men who hadn't really thought about these issues. And why should they have done? They just hadn't. They were racing men. And so I've overheard them saying things like, let's say to a 13 or 14-year-old boy, "You drove really gay, mate. You drove gay today. Make sure you don't do that in the next race." And not only should one not say that, because gay is not a pejorative adjective to be used in that way, but what if the young man or boy, because usually is boys, can be girls, of course, but let's just say boys at the moment, because that's usually the kind of person that type of insult is thrown at. Let's say he is in his rites of passage trying to work out who he is or whom he's going to love because he's 14 and he hasn't quite worked it out. Or let's say he's absolutely 100% certain that he is heterosexual. In either case, don't say you drove really gay, because either you're going to upset a boy who's thinking, well, I might be gay, I'm not quite sure, or you're going to normalize that insult to be recycled by someone who shouldn't really have an influential adult showing them that it's okay to speak like that. But the thing is, when you explain it to karting bosses, they accept it. Oh, Christ, I've never really thought of it like that. Yeah, good point. I won't say that again. Because they're not horrible people. They're nice people. But they've just never thought about it before. So we do that. And then the other thing we do is help older people. And I'm talking about people in their 40s or even 50s who might be mechanics or engineers, particularly because it so happens that people in those professions within Formula One teams, for some reason, are not so usually embraced as potentially LGBTQ plus in a way that a journalist or a photographer or a videographer or a marketer or a comms person would be now much more. And they sometimes come to me or sometimes send me an anonymous email, not from their Red Bull or their Mercedes account, but from their Gmail account, saying, I work for, McLaren, whatever, and I have worked there for 17 years, and I can't come out now, but I'm out. I'm married, actually. I'm married to my same-sex partner, my husband. I'm out to my family. I'm out to his family. He's out to his work. We're out to our neighbors. We're out to all our friends. And the only place we can't come out is in the Formula One factory that I work at. And you think, well, that can't be right. So we go into the factories and I tell those stories.
Yeah.
And I say to the teams, I say, you ought to address this. You ought to address this not only because it's the right thing to do, because you don't want your mechanics and engineers feeling like that, but also if they are feeling like that, they won't give up their best work. So they'll be distracted. They'll make mistakes. So actually, if you have a robust and successful LGBTQ plus policy that makes your LGBTQ plus employees feel good, they'll make fewer mistakes and your cars will go faster.
Yeah.
That gets their attention. So, and then they embrace it. And, Racing Pride currently works with 5 Formula One teams. If I can just reel them off from memory, I think it's Aston Martin, Alpine, Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren. And we'd love to work with the other 5 too.
Amazing. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about what I view as your personal brand. You might not see it as this, but your hashtag on this day tweets on Twitter, X, I see that as That is Matt Bishop. When I come onto Twitter, if I see it, I don't need to read that it's your name because I know it's going to say your name. How did that begin? When did that even begin?
So that began, my McLaren chapter ended in the middle of 2017. And I was 54 and I'd worked since I was 18. I hadn't ever been out of work. And I'd worked bloody hard. And, I'm not a rich man, but I managed to put away a few bob. And I thought, well, I'm not going to rush back to work. So I wrote a novel, which is called The Boy Made the Difference and has nothing to do with motor racing. All proceeds go to charity, by the way. There you are. You can buy it on Amazon in paperback or Kindle format. Anyway, and all proceeds go to charities, I say. Anyway, I did that because I wanted to do that, because my mother was a novelist, and my grandmother was a novelist, and my great-grandmother was a poetess and a suffragist. And I was brought up to love books and to read voraciously, which I still do. So I thought I had a book in me. I mean, I've written, as I say, the Emerson Fittipaldi book, but I mean a novel, a fictional novel. So that was a great pleasure to do. And once I'd done that, I thought, well, actually, during the course of doing that, I thought I can't disappear off the face of the Formula One earth. It might take me 6 months to write this book. It took me 8 months. But I don't want to disappear altogether. So I thought, what can I do? And I've always loved the history of the sport. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll start a daily thing on Twitter on this day. And either on this day, Stirling Moss won the Monaco Grand Prix in 1956, or on this day, Patrick Depailler was born, or on this day, Jean Berrat was killed, or whatever it is. And I didn't really know it was going to be such a thing, but I started doing it in probably the autumn of 2017. So that's now 7 years ago. And I've done it more or less every day since. And sometimes I recycle the same tweet. If I think, well, let me think. I last tweeted that 4 years ago. So nobody's going to remember. I'm going to use the same words, but I might find a different picture, or I might change the words slightly. And sometimes, even now, I completely think of a different angle and decide to do it in a different way. And I don't do every single anniversary, because otherwise it'd just be too much and too busy and too time consuming. So I must admit, I don't commemorate every Lewis Hamilton win, much as I'm a huge Hamilton fan, but there's more than 100 of them. And I don't therefore do every Michael Schumacher win, or every Ayrton Senna win, or every Alan Prost win as well. By the way, occasionally people say, why haven't you done Michael Schumacher? He won the Belgian Grand Prix today. Or why haven't you done Alan Prost? He won the French Grand Prix today. You must hate them, otherwise you'd have done them. I said, I don't. I'm not. I don't have a contract with the world or with Twitter X to make sure that I never miss a single anniversary. It's a labour of love, and I often do tweet about Michael Schumacher and Alan Prost and all the people I'm purported to loathe, but don't loathe at all. But Twitter X is an utter cesspit of morons, as well as some very nice people. But my God, it's a cesspit of morons as well. And as people often talk about the hatred on Twitter X, there is, but there's also so much stupidity, and lots of lovely people. And by the way, 99% of my followers are absolutely wonderful, and I'm grateful for them. And I try to engage with their questions, and I'm utterly honoured to have their questions. I mean, some people ask me stupid questions I don't always answer, or if they ask me something I don't know, sometimes I say I don't know, but sometimes I think, what's the point of me even answering that? Because I might not know. Or sometimes I think, well, you've asked me something that the only way I could find out is by Googling it for you. Well, you could do that yourself, couldn't you? And then, of course, I do get homophobic insults. So anyway, but no, I do it because I love it, and it has become a habit. and it kicks off my day. And I do birthdays, death days occasionally, not every death day, not every birthday, not every race day. Recently, I've begun to embrace non-championship Formula One races in a bigger way because I find them so interesting, and they have no media coverage whatsoever. So, you can suddenly find that you're, writing about the Alton Park Gold Cup, which was a big race in the 60s and early 70s, but was non-championship. And there were many, many non-championship races. Do you know, for instance, that in the 60s, there were more non-championship Formula One races than there were World Championship Formula One races in some seasons? Well, nobody knew that, do they? So I find that fun. I also find it fun doing an On This Day on January the 1st, let's say, usually South Africa. And people think, there was a Grand Prix then? Oh, yes. And I think it might be quite fun if there still was a New Year's Day Grand Prix somewhere. And January and February were big for the Argentine and Brazilian Grand Prix back in the day. Anyway, I love it all. I absolutely love it all. I'm going to say one more thing about it, because it's not just because of the geeky historical aspect. Sometimes rather moving things happen. So this happens probably about once every couple of months. I will tweet about someone. On this day, so-and-so was born. He started one Grand Prix. And then I'll find a picture of him in a Connaught or, something like that, or an HWM. Obviously, the makes of racing car that no longer exist. And then maybe I might, about 3 or 4 days later, I might see a tweet. Somebody's tweeted me from a brand new account. You can see when the account was formed. And it says, "I followed you. Could you please send me a DM?" They've got no followers. They follow one person, me. And so I send them a DM and I say, "Go ahead." And then they reply and they say, "I'm 67. And my father is in an old folks home. And I was made aware of your tweet and I printed it out. And I took it to him." Or sometimes even, "My grandfather is the person you tweeted about and he's dead, but my mum is in an old folks home," and I printed out the tweet and I took it to her and I showed it to her, and she's 91, and she said, "What's this, darling?" And I said, "This is a motor racing person, a Formula One journalist person, who's just tweeted about your dad, my granddad." And the old lady weeps in her old folks home. She says, "I haven't heard anyone talk about my daddy for donkey's years." You mean to say that somebody, a journalist now, has just written about my daddy, who might have died in 1967?
Yeah.
Yes, Mum. Yes. I find it incredibly touching. Touching. And of course, Twitter X is full of, idiots and morons. But it also, if used correctly and kindly, it can bring joy.
Yeah.
And, I've had a few things like that. And I always find them incredibly, incredibly moving.
See, social media can be beautiful, just if you use it right. Right.
It can.
We're nearing the end now. This is something I'd love to know. If you could speak to your younger self now, what would you say to him? What would you say?
What would I say? I'd say, well, look, I'd say two things. Two things which have become mantras that I live by, I think, as best I can. One is live and let live. So what does live and let live really mean? It means do live. Try to enjoy yourself. Try to live your best life in whatever way that may be, which includes giving yourself the best opportunity to take enjoyment from life, but also facilitating the best opportunity for others to do the same. And don't be horrible to people. as far as you possibly can be. And by the way, we all fail from time to time, but try your best not to be. So live and let live. This is a great life. There are beautiful things. You know, somebody will think, what an idiot. I'm looking out of my window in my garden and I'm seeing a squirrel gambolling. I like silly words like gambolling. I don't mean gambling. Gambolling on a tree. And that's a beautiful thing, you know. And when I've passed away, and I hope that won't be for many years, I will, you know, I will be pleased that I was able to look out of the window and see a squirrel gambolling on my tree. I know somebody's going to put on Twitter, what a fucking idiot. But anyway, doesn't matter. I'm not an idiot. And so I think live and let live. And the second one is if in doubt, say yes. And they're related, because if in doubt, say yes means this. It means be brave, go for it. And obviously I don't mean say yes to every suggestion that anybody comes up with. If somebody comes up with a stupid suggestion or an evil suggestion, shall we murder this person? Shall we commit this crime? Obviously not, but you shouldn't be in doubt. You shouldn't be in doubt, you should just say no. So if in doubt, say a yes means I've had an opportunity, this is hypothetical, I've had an opportunity to go and work in Toronto, Canada. Should I do it? Yes. Yes. I've been offered an opportunity to go and work for Matt Bishop's comms agency instead of going to university. Should I do it? Yes. And sometimes you will make mistakes. Sometimes those yeses should have been no's, but you're going to make mistakes through your life anyway.
Yeah.
But I think if you err towards yes more often than you err towards no, you will end up, by the time you turn your toes up when you're 90, having had a better, more enjoyable, more successful, and more joy-giving life than if you'd said no instead of yes.
Finally, I'm going to quickly ask you just a little piece of advice to anyone listening who is wanting to go into a similar field that you've worked in. What would you tell them?
Well, I've answered it a few times, I suppose, in the last hour. I've skated and skirted around that. I suppose all I'd say is fully believe that if somebody can do this, that somebody can be you. You know, I think I struggled. You know, people have imposter syndrome, don't they? Even after they found their way into a place that or a profession that they aspired to be in, and people lack confidence or self-belief. Some people don't, by the way. Some people don't. You know, typically top sportsmen and women don't. You know, if you ask a Formula One driver who's the best Formula One driver in the sport, they'll say themselves, and they'll pass a polygraph lie detector test by saying that. And you wouldn't want them to say anything else. If they said, well, I think I'm the 8th best, you think, I don't think we'll be hiring him. So, but a lot of people aren't as confident as that. And that kind of realistic lack of confidence can be quite a attractive trait because it's the opposite of arrogance. But nonetheless, if you really want something, remember that somebody is going to do that job that you want. So if you really push hard for it, it might and really could be you. And, you know, don't be deterred and don't be daunted, and pick yourself up when you're knocked down, because your competition may not pick themselves up when they've been knocked down, and you will be knocked down because you will apply for jobs that you don't get and so on and so forth. But if you do pick yourself up when you've been knocked down, and others don't, you're already putting yourself ahead of them in the rat race or the competition for the job that you want so much. So that's what I'd say. In a nutshell, believe in yourself.
Well, Matt, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. You've been absolutely incredible. We will be back again soon to chat all about careers.
Thank you.